What if the biggest warning about Trump's trade war isn't coming from Canada at all, but from the heart of corporate America itself? What if the people most worried about this fight are not politicians, not foreign leaders, but the very businesses that helped elect this administration in the first place? Before we go any further, if you care about your job, your paycheck, or the price of everything you buy, hit that like button right now. Subscribe if you want the full story every single time it breaks. And if you know someone who runs a business or works for one, send this to them, because what you're about to hear affects them directly. Here's the strange part of this story. When a government picks a fight with another country, you expect the loudest voices in support to come from inside that government. You expect cheering from the people who wrote the policy. But that is not what happened this weekend. Instead, two of the most powerful business organizations in the United States, groups that speak for nearly every major company in the country, stood up and publicly asked their own government to stop fighting and go back to the table. That is not normal. Big business groups do not like public fights with the White House. They prefer quiet phone calls, private meetings, careful language that never makes headlines. So when they choose to speak out loud, in public, on the record, it usually means something has gone seriously wrong behind the scenes. Let's rewind and understand how we got here, because the timeline actually tells you more than any single headline can. For weeks, the United States and Canada had been negotiating over tariffs, trying to work out a new trade arrangement before an old deadline expired. As that deadline crept closer, the tone from Washington's business community stayed calm, cautious but calm. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, one of the oldest and most influential business lobbying groups in the country, released a statement urging both governments to keep talking. Nothing dramatic, just a polite nudge toward patience, but buried inside that same statement was a number that should have made everyone pay attention. The Chamber warned that new tariffs on Canadian goods could put 13 million American jobs at risk. Not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, 13 million. That number did not come from a Canadian official trying to score political points. It came from an American business organization warning Americans about the cost to their own economy. Sit with that number for a second. 13 million jobs tied to trade between two countries that share the longest border in the world. That is roughly 1 out of every 12 working Americans, all connected in some way to the flow of goods between the United States and Canada. Cars, dairy, lumber, energy, machinery, parts that cross the border 5 or 6 times before a single finished product ever reaches a store shelf. This is not a small trading relationship. It is one of the most tightly woven economic partnerships on the planet. And then, right at the deadline, everything fell apart. Late on a Friday night, just minutes before talks were set to expire, negotiations collapsed. Completely. Within moments, new tariffs of 50% went into effect on $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. Dairy products, alcohol, vehicles, building materials, clothing, all suddenly far more expensive to bring across the border. The Canadian Prime Minister appeared publicly the very next morning and did not hold back. He called the new American tariffs a miscalculation, and he confirmed that Canada would respond with equal force, matching the tariffs, dollar for dollar. He placed the blame directly on what he described as unfair and unreasonable demands from the American side. That is, the moment this stopped being a policy disagreement and became something people could actually feel. Real tariffs on real goods, moving across a real border, hitting real businesses that had built their entire operations around the assumption that this relationship would remain stable. And this is exactly when the American business community stopped being cautious and started sounding the alarm. Both the Chamber of Commerce and another powerful coalition, the Business Roundtable, which represents chief executives from some of the largest companies in the country, issued fresh statements. This time, the language was sharper. Both groups directly called on the American and Canadian governments to return to negotiations. The reporting on those statements described the two economies as tightly interconnected and warned that a full breakup between them would be, in their own words, deeply disruptive. Think about what that really means. These are not activists. These are not political commentators. These are people whose entire job is to protect the interests of businesses that build cars, ship food, manufacture parts, and employ millions of workers. When organizations like that start using words like disruptive in public, it is not exaggeration. It is closer to a warning label. Now here is the detail that changes how you should think about this entire collapse, and it is the part most coverage glosses over far too quickly. Just 2 days before everything fell apart, on the Wednesday before that fateful Friday night, American negotiators had reportedly already agreed to lower existing tariffs on cars and metals, cutting them from 25% down to 15% as part of a broader deal that was taking shape. In other words, this was not a negotiation collapsing because the two sides were miles apart. By Wednesday, real progress had been made. Real concessions were on the table. The kind of movement that usually signals a deal is close. So what changed in those final 48 hours? What happened between a Wednesday full of progress and a Friday night full of collapse? That question is the one keeping business leaders on both sides of the border up at night. Because if two governments can get that close to an agreement and still walk away from each other, it raises a much bigger question. Is any deal actually reachable right now? Or is the distance between these two countries less about the details on paper and more about something else entirely? Something political, something personal, something that no amount of economic logic can fix. So where does the American government actually stand today? The clearest answer came directly from the United States Trade Representative in an interview over the weekend. Asked plainly whether any new talks with Canada were being planned, his answer left no room for interpretation. There are no new talks planned. The administration, he said, is moving forward with measures responding to what it calls Canadian retaliation. He went further, placing this entire fight inside a much bigger story about trade policy. According to him, the administration's approach is designed to bring manufacturing back to American soil and protect American jobs. And, in his framing, two countries have chosen to retaliate against that policy, China and Canada. Read that carefully, because it tells you exactly how the White House wants this story understood. Not as a painful rupture with one of America's oldest and closest trading partners, not as a breakdown with the country's largest single trading relationship, but as one small chapter inside a much larger battle. The administration believes it is winning, a battle worth the short-term pain because of the long-term goal. And that is the exact gap the business community is trying to close with its public statements. The administration sees these tariffs as leverage, a tool that will eventually force better terms down the road. The business community sees the exact same tariffs as an active, ongoing cost, one that is already showing up in supply chains, in pricing, and in the millions of jobs the Chamber warned about before this even reached its current stage. Those two views cannot both be right at the same time. One side believes the pain is temporary and worth it. The other side believes the pain is already real and getting worse. And right now, nobody knows which side is going to be proven correct. It is worth being precise about what the Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable are actually asking for, because it is not quite as dramatic as it might sound at first. They are not taking Canada's side. They are not attacking the administration directly. They are simply asking both governments to return to the negotiating table. That is it. A position that puts them at odds with the current standoff itself, rather than with either country specifically. But that distinction matters enormously. It tells you these statements are not political theater. They are coming from organizations whose entire purpose is protecting the businesses they represent. And right now, both of those organizations are on record saying the current situation is bad for those businesses, no matter which government you think is technically right. And this reaction has not stayed confined to boardrooms and lobbying offices in Washington. Elected officials representing states with the deepest ties to this trade relationship have started speaking out too. One senator from a northern border state posted publicly within hours of the new tariffs taking effect, warning that the 50% tariffs on Canadian goods mean higher costs for small businesses, farmers, and everyday families in her state, a state where Canada is the single largest trading partner. She placed the blame directly on the administration's handling of the situation. That is a sitting elected official using the exact same core argument as the Chamber of Commerce, that this dispute translates directly into higher costs for ordinary people, but delivering it as a political attack rather than a business statement. The economic argument and the political argument have converged, and they are both pointing in the same direction. Now let's take a moment to talk about how businesses on the Canadian side of the border are responding to all of this, because the picture there is far more complicated than a simple story of Canadian business uniformly opposed to American tariffs. And understanding that complexity tells you just how deep the standoff actually runs. All right, quick pause here. If this kind of breakdown is genuinely useful to you, do me a favor and tap that thumbs up. It costs nothing, takes 1 second, and it tells this channel to keep making videos like this one instead of the shallow, rushed versions you'll find everywhere else. Now, back to the story. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce issued one of the sharpest statements of this entire episode, calling the new tariffs a direct blow to competitiveness across the entire continent and describing the whole situation as a self-defeating trade saga. Their warning went even further, stating plainly that Americans will see their own costs rise, while Canadian businesses will watch customers and investment disappear. That is a Canadian business leader explicitly warning American consumers, not just Canadian exporters, that this fight is going to show up in their own household budgets. A message clearly designed to build pressure inside the United States just as much as it documents the damage happening inside Canada, but not. Every Canadian business voice sees this the same way. In Alberta, home to much of Canada's oil and gas industry, the Calgary Chamber of Commerce actually threw its support behind the Prime Minister's decision to walk away from the table rather than accept an unfavorable deal. Their chief executive stated firmly that no deal is better than a bad deal, adding that her organization felt encouraged by the government's unwavering commitment to protecting the country's sovereignty and economic competitiveness. That is a meaningfully different tone from the National Chamber's statement, and it reflects a genuine split inside Canadian business circles. On one side, there are those who want a deal reached as fast as possible to stop the bleeding immediately. On the other side, there are those who believe walking away from unfavorable terms, even if it costs real money in the short term, is the smarter long-term choice. The head of the Business Council of Canada landed somewhere in the middle of these two positions. He said his organization remains hopeful that both countries will eventually find common ground, but that, for now, the priority needs to shift towards strengthening Canada's own economy and directly supporting the businesses hit hardest by the tariffs. He echoed the same idea that no deal is better than a bad deal, but added that this is a moment for the country to stand united, saying that history shows what can be achieved when everyone works together. Notice something important there. Even the more conciliatory voices inside Canadian business circles are still defending the decision to walk away rather than accept bad terms, just to end the standoff quickly. That tells you something meaningful. Even among those hoping for a fast resolution, there's broad agreement that walking away was defensible, even if the economic pain that follows is very real. Now, if we zoom down to the level of individual businesses, rather than the big organizations that speak for them, the tone shifts again. It becomes less about strategy and more about pure, immediate survival. One senior policy official with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce described just how disorienting the pace of change has been for companies trying to plan their futures. He pointed out that in a single recent year, there were more than 50 separate changes to American tariff and tax policy affecting Canadian trade. That works out to more than one change every single week. He explained that this constant uncertainty has caused situations too. A job, a relationship, any kind of negotiation at all. The side holding real options tends to be the side holding real power, no matter how loud the other side gets in the meantime. If you're still with me, that probably means this story is landing the way I hoped it would. So let's do something a little different this time. Instead of asking for a like, I want you to actually type something. In the comments, tell me one moment in your own life where staying quiet and preparing quietly worked better than reacting loudly. I genuinely read these, and stories like that are half the reason this channel exists. And if you know someone who's currently in a tense negotiation of their own, a job offer, a difficult client, a hard conversation coming up, send them this video. It might change how they walk into that room. Inside the United States, the political ripple effects are becoming harder to ignore. This isn't staying confined to trade statistics buried in reports nobody reads. It's showing up in state-level politics, especially in regions most directly affected by rising energy costs and disrupted supply chains. Governors in northern states, the ones with the deepest ties to Canadian energy and trade, have begun raising concerns publicly. These aren't abstract political talking points. These are officials responding to measurable pressure on their local economies, businesses absorbing rising costs, families facing higher utility bills, industries watching supply chains they'd relied on for decades shift beneath them without warning. At the same time, there are reportedly discussions happening in Washington across party lines about limiting how much power any single administration should have to impose sweeping tariffs without needing approval from Congress first. That kind of conversation doesn't start casually. It starts when there's genuine concern that a strategy has produced more risk than benefit, and that some kind of safeguard might be needed to prevent a similar situation from happening again. What makes this whole situation so interesting is watching how differently both sides chose to handle the same pressure. One side built its entire approach around escalation. Raise tariffs, apply. Pressure, wait for a reaction. And when that reaction doesn't come the way it was expected to, the natural instinct is often to escalate even further, to turn up the intensity and hope something eventually breaks. But here's the flaw sitting quietly inside that approach. When the other side has already built alternatives, every additional round of tariffs doesn't just apply pressure outward, it applies pressure inward too. Higher tariffs on Canadian goods mean higher costs for American businesses that depend on those goods, and those higher costs eventually land on American consumers. It isn't a one-directional weapon. It behaves more like a valve that presses on both sides of the same pipe. The other side built its approach around patience. Don't react emotionally. Don't escalate the rhetoric. Quietly diversify, build relationships elsewhere, and let time reveal whether the pressure being applied against you actually has the teeth it claims to have. Laid side by side, it becomes fairly clear why one side ended up in a stronger position than almost anyone predicted. Confrontation without alternatives is mostly just noise. Confrontation backed by alternatives that already exist is leverage. And leverage, real leverage, is exactly what Canada now holds in this relationship. in a way it simply didn't before. It's worth thinking seriously about what this means going forward, because these consequences won't disappear once the news cycle moves on to the next story. Trade relationships that take decades to build don't rebuild themselves overnight, and they don't unravel overnight either. What's happening here looks more like a slow, deliberate redirection of long-term economic flows. Energy contracts signed years into the future. Pharmaceutical agreements restructured around new priorities. Lumber and manufacturing relationships renegotiated with entirely different partners in mind. Even if political tension eases at some point, even if a new agreement eventually gets signed between these two countries, some of these newly built relationships won't simply disappear. Once a country builds a reliable partnership with a new buyer, walking away from it just to return to old habits rarely makes economic sense. Businesses on both sides of these new deals now have their own reasons to keep them running smoothly. In other words, some of what has shifted here might be permanent, or at least far harder to fully reverse than most people originally assumed. And that's the real lasting cost for the United States in all of this. Not just the immediate pain showing up in construction costs or energy bills, but the long-term restructuring of relationships that used to be treated as a permanent, unshakable given. Think about how strange this would have sounded a year earlier. A country reshaping its entire trade map, not out of anger, but out of patience. Not with a press conference, but with a series of quiet signatures on documents most people never even heard about until they were already done. That's not the kind of story that usually makes for dramatic television. There's no shouting match, no walkout, no viral moment to replay. And maybe that's exactly why it worked. Nobody was watching closely enough to stop it because nobody believed it was actually happening until the paperwork was already signed. There's a broader lesson buried underneath all of this that goes far beyond trade policy. Trust, in any relationship between two countries, two companies, or two people, isn't something you can rebuild the moment you decide you want it back. It's built slowly, through consistency, through reliability, through years of both sides being able to count on each other without having to think about it. And it can be damaged far faster than it can ever be repaired. When one side of a long-standing partnership starts to feel like decisions are being made unpredictably, based on pressure rather than mutual respect, that side naturally starts protecting itself. It starts building alternatives. It starts spreading out its risk. And once that process genuinely begins, it becomes very difficult to fully undo, even long after the original tension has passed. That's essentially what happened here. Canada didn't set out to become less reliant on the United States out of resentment or hostility. It did it as a form of protection, a hedge against unpredictability. And now that the hedge exists, it isn't simply going to disappear because tensions ease. It's worth asking a bigger question at this point. What does real strength actually look like in a moment like this? It's easy to assume strength means loud, aggressive, highly visible action. Tariffs, threats, dramatic statements built to dominate headlines and news cycles. That kind of strength feels powerful because it's immediate. It grabs attention instantly. But what played out here suggests something almost the opposite. Real strength, the kind that actually shifts outcomes in the long run, often looks quiet. It looks like patience. It looks like preparation completed long before anyone else was paying attention. It looks like calm, methodical decision-making instead of loud, reactive escalation. Mark Carney didn't win this moment by being louder than anyone else in the room. He won it, at least so far, by being more prepared, by understanding that leverage built quietly over years is far more durable than pressure applied loudly in a single moment. And that lesson reaches well beyond international trade. Anyone who has ever negotiated anything, a salary, a contract, a major decision that mattered, knows deep down that the side holding options, holding alternatives, holding a plan built before the pressure ever arrived, almost always ends up in the stronger position. The side scrambling to react in real time, no matter how loud it gets, is usually the side with less actual control over the outcome. So what happens next? The current administration has a few paths available, and honestly, none of them are easy. One option is to escalate further, apply even more tariffs, and hope the pressure eventually becomes unbearable enough to force a change in direction. But given everything already playing out, more tariffs simply mean more cost passed on to American businesses and consumers, without any guarantee that Canada, now holding real alternatives, would respond any differently than it already has. Another option is to shift toward genuine negotiation, acknowledging that the original assumption about leverage didn't hold up the way it was expected to. That path requires a kind of political flexibility that's often hard to display publicly, because fairly or not, it can look like backing down. And the third option is simply to let things continue as they are, allowing the relationship to keep drifting in its current direction while hoping conditions eventually shift in a more favorable way on their own. That path avoids any dramatic public reversal, but it also risks letting the current strain keep building without a clear resolution anywhere in sight. None of these options offer a clean, easy win. And that, more than anything else, shows just how significantly the situation has changed from where it started only months ago. Meanwhile, the rest of the world isn't just watching this passively from a distance. Trade negotiators, economic policymakers, and government officials across multiple continents are studying exactly how this unfolded, step by step. Because the real lesson here isn't really about Canada specifically. It's about a broader shift in how economic pressure functions in a world where alternatives are becoming far more accessible than they used to be. The old model assumed a kind of one-directional leverage, where one dominant economy applies pressure and smaller economies simply adjust in response. But that model only works when smaller economies genuinely lack alternatives. As global trade networks grow more interconnected, as more countries build relationships with multiple partners instead of leaning heavily on just one, that old model becomes noticeably less reliable. And what happened between the United States and Canada here might end up being remembered as an early, clear example of exactly that shift. A moment when an assumption that had held firm for decades quietly stopped being true, and the country on the receiving end of pressure turned out to have far more options than anyone in power expected. Let's bring this back down to something a little more personal, because it's easy to get lost in trade percentages and lose sight of what's actually at stake underneath all of it. This story, at its core, isn't really about tariffs or specific industries or economic charts. It's about a much simpler question that applies far beyond international politics. When pressure is applied against you, do you react emotionally or do you respond strategically? Do you scramble in the moment or do you rely on preparation you quietly put in place long before the pressure ever showed up at your door? Mark Carney's approach here offers a pretty clear answer. Stay calm, don't let outside pressure dictate your emotional state. Build your alternatives quietly, long before you actually need them, not frantically after the crisis has already begun. And when the moment finally comes to act with quiet confidence rather than loud desperation. That's not just smart trade policy. That's a mindset that applies to nearly every high-pressure moment life eventually throws at any of us. So where does all of this leave things right now as the story continues to unfold in real time? The relationship between the United States and Canada isn't broken beyond repair. Deep. Economic ties built over generations don't simply disappear because of one difficult stretch. But something here has genuinely shifted, and it isn't likely to fully reset back to exactly how things were before. Canada has demonstrated clearly and publicly that it has real alternatives. The United States has felt, clearly and directly, what happens economically when a long-standing partner starts operating with genuine independence instead of assumed dependence. The rest of the world has watched every step of this unfold, quietly taking notes for its own future negotiations. If there's one thing this entire situation makes unmistakably clear, it's this. Assumptions about power, especially assumptions built on the belief that someone else has no other options, are dangerous precisely because they're rarely tested until it's already too late to adjust course. Mark Carney didn't need to raise his voice to prove that Canada had options. He simply needed to build them quietly, patiently, and let the results speak entirely for themselves. And now the whole world is left asking a very different question than the one Washington expected to be asking back when this began. Not whether Canada would fold under pressure, but whether the old assumptions about economic power still hold up at all in a world that has grown far more interconnected, far more flexible, and far less willing to accept pressure as the final word. That question doesn't have a simple answer yet, but one thing is already certain. This didn't end the way anyone in Washington expected it to. And how the rest of it unfolds is going to shape more than just one trade relationship. It's going to shape how countries everywhere think about patience, preparation, and real power for a long time to come. If this changed the way you think about strength, remember, it isn't the loudest voice in the room that usually wins. It's the one who was quietly ready long before the room ever got loud. Like this video if it made you think. Subscribe if you want more stories like it. And share it with someone who still believes pressure always beats patience. They might change their mind by the end of it.